biggest concern for your business when it comes to energy?
Well, the cost, yeah, that's definitely the biggest concern, and cash flow. Yeah, I think those are the two main things.
Have you taken any steps to try and reduce your energy bill?
We try to turn off the gas as soon as we finish, and then with the lights, but it's still that doesn't help much.
I can't really take any sort of step because I'm not the landlord. If I would be the landlord, I might put some solar panel, and to be honest, I don't really know how to bring it down.
What changes or what would help you to manage your energy use or your energy consumption better?
Yeah, I think that kind of smart metering or that sort of thing would have been helpful, but it's not something we're going to invest in now. All right, we don't own the building. It's like, okay, is the landlord going to do that? Highly unlikely.
It's a little bit complicated. I think those companies try to to make you confused.
Actually, I think cash flow is one of the other key issues. Working with a provider that would take that into account. What benefits do we have for paying a little bit extra now versus later? When we have some cash available, can we get some kind of discount in advance for paying in advance or other things like that, right? So some more creativity and innovation on the billing and cash flow management side would be awesome.
There you go. It's a starting point as to this discussion today, because Energy Consumers Australia has constitutionally a remit to cover two core groups. It's not just residential households. It's very clear in our establishment and in our operations that we've also got an unambiguous responsibility to look after small business consumers as well. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. As you can see here, we've got a panel, some of whom will be familiar to many of you, but let me quickly go through them all as we go through them. First of all, Alexi Boyd. Alexi is, of course, also runs her own small business Matters. Look for the podcast. Alexi has done research work, some seminal work for ECA into a range of small business issues, some of which we'll discuss today, and previously was CEO of the national peak body for the small business sector in Australia, the Council of Small Business Organisations of Australia. Next to her is Rob Mallett. Rob is the CEO of the Tasmanian Small Business Council, and Tasmania is one of the few states where small business industry associations have been able to successfully come together and form their own body, which represents uniquely the needs of small business industry bodies as opposed to industry groups just more generally as well. And the Tas Small Business Council has again also been extensively involved over many years with ECA's work. Next to him is Phil Kemp. Phil is the CEO of Business Foundations, an economic development and small business advisory service based in Western Australia, but with an outreach not only across that state, but much of the rest of Australia. And Phil has also been the chair of a number of small business industry and professional bodies, both in Australia, such as Small Enterprise, Self-Employment Australia, as well as business incubator associations across the Asia-Pacific region. And finally, filling out the square there is Dr. Andrew Nance from South Australia, who is Director of the Energy Project. So we've got a broad representation not only of different parts of the sector, but also geographically as well. South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania and New South Wales. Now, I'm not as good at Slido or setting things up in advance as Erin was. That was a great presentation, Erin. So a quick throw-out question to the room. If we took all the businesses in Australia, whether it be the Rios, whether it be the Coles, whether it be the Telstras, we pulled together all the businesses in Australia and we asked to sort of look at how big their workforce typically is. What's the average size of the workforce of a company in Australia? What do you think the average size of a business is? How many people does it typically employ? No one here to answer, mind you. But anyone want to venture a question? Anyone venture? You've got some statistics there, but anyone want to venture what the average is? Go on, take a punt. You're very scared here. It's not on Slido. 20? I've got a bid here, an auction. 20. Has anyone got better? Catherine? 2. Anyone, third one anywhere else? 5. Oh, Brian, you have cheated because it is actually about 5. Nice work. It's a sobering figure.
Actually, it's 3.5.
Well, there you go. Now, the figure is it's a sobering figure, and this chart here shows, and what we really wanted to point out here is that whilst the attention largely is on that very big corporate end of Australia, you can see there that numerically it's a very, very small component of the overall business population of this country. And it's not just by staff, it's by a whole variety of other factors. I won't go into them all now, but a really sobering figure is that most Australian businesses generate less than $200,000 a year. They actually work on really thin, really small margins. They have, as we've just shown, very small staff, but they also have incredibly low profitability, very low survival rates, and also very low income as well. So these are the sort of figures that I think give us pause when sometimes there's a temptation to think if you're in the private sector, you must be doing well. The reality is that the bulk of our businesses can often be highly marginal. So with that as a starting point, today we're going to explore where the vulnerable businesses sit, and that is overwhelmingly the small business sector in terms of the energy transition. So we're going to go through four principal questions here, one for each member of the panel, and then we'll throw it open for further discussion from the room. I'm bound to make sure that you get out to afternoon tea on time because I know that is the death zone in an afternoon. You want to make sure you get back out there. So Alexi, first question. You've done, as I mentioned before, a body of research for ECA into the energy experience for small businesses. What did you find and what are the key things we need to be aware of?
Thanks, Michael. I'd encourage everyone to have a look at the ECA website. It was called Power Over Their Power. And the purpose was really to engage with small business groups, associations, industry groups, industry bodies, and representative bodies in the small business space to really find out what they needed from policymakers. And I guess it was a driver to say, well, what is it that you need? How can we support you? How can ECA better represent the needs of small business and have a better understanding of those? And I guess the 3 key recommendations that came out of it, and this will be definitely not something unusual to those of you who have advocated in the consumer space, especially those in the small business space. But I guess those 3 key takeaways were right information, right time, and trusted pathways and resources to be able to get that information. Now, if you watched that video just before us, I think one of the things that really struck me was that the small businesses in that video really had no idea what they were talking about when it came to their energy bills. They didn't know where to go for support. They didn't necessarily know what to do to mitigate or reduce the costs. They were confused about what sort of support there was out there. So that was one of the main things that did come out of that Power Over Their Power report. The second part was regulatory frameworks needed to consider the diversity of small businesses. And I think this is one thing that policymakers often come back to, and they often say, oh, it's so hard to talk to small businesses. There's so many of you and you're so disparate and you're so spread out across the country. And I would argue that if you actually listen to those who are experts in the field and say, well, how do we talk to small businesses? Because you guys manage it, you know, the retailers manage it and the tradie organisations and those that represent and Tasmanian Small Business Council, they can speak to them. So using those trusted channels of communication is really important. And the last thing is designing practical assistance with small businesses in mind, not households. So actually saying, well, yes, I don't have control. I may be in an embedded network, or I don't have control over my energy, how to source it, or how to get information about it, or even where it comes from. So speaking to them a language that they understand and making sure that the practical advice is designed for a small business, maybe in that sector, maybe in that location, maybe in that region, and maybe according to the sort of usage that they have with their piece. And the last thing I wanted to add as well is that in terms of concern at the moment around energy, it's very interesting to see some of the statistics to come out of the Business Insights reports, such as Business New South Wales. They do some great surveys around what small businesses are thinking and conditions and what's their major concerns in their business. Energy has actually dropped to number 4, but it has been in the top 3 since the beginning of 2023. And I wonder whether or not that's because people are starting to get a better understanding, or that other concerns are becoming bigger and more problematic. So I think it's a really interesting space to watch, and I would encourage everybody here to look at those condition surveys to just see where energy sits in small businesses. They are 32% of GDP. They are collectively the largest employer in the private sector, so they can't, shouldn't and mustn't be ignored by policymakers in particular, and they shouldn't be put in the too hard basket.
Well, there's some features about the sector. Rob, what is it that makes them perhaps unique compared to, for example, big business or to residential households? What makes them different?
First of all, can we do a non-Slido survey? Hands up anybody here who is a small business person. Not that your wife, husband, spouse, somebody else has it. Hands up high if you are a small business person. So we have very few. We have very few. And that's part of the issue. The small business sector across the board are a community of sucker-uppers. We don't grizzle. We work hard, we apply ourselves to our business, we look after our staff, we look after our family, but, you know, are we grizzlers? We're not. And so that makes it a challenge for the small business sector, who is somewhat underrepresented also by peak bodies. So Tasmanian Small Business Council, as you said, is the only organisation that's state-based that has a broad overview of policy issues to government and senior public servants and regulators as to issues that affect the small business sector. But in every other state, and I say state, there are individual industry associations, but energy is just one of their minor things that they have to look after. There's a lot of other things that they have to do within that profession. So they don't tend to take on energy in a national sense. They don't tend to take on regulators at all. The only other organisation is COSBOA, which has exactly the same structure as the Tasmanian Small Business Council, and they occasionally do get involved in some of those issues. So that's part of it. We don't have a collective strong enough voice to talk to regulators, to talk to governments, to put pressure on retailers to change the way we do things. And the other critical thing is, which is a real shame because we don't have enough of that really strong representation out there in the community, is that the small business sector, I definitely know in Tasmania, but across the board I would imagine, pay more per kilowatt hour than any other sector. The big end of town, they've got people who on their payroll who go and organise contracts. We've got the community sector, they're out there and they've got great organisations through their causes and all that sort of stuff, who are very effective in getting rebates and considerations and all those sorts of things. But residences, to some degree, there's so many people who are out there in residences that they vote. And there's a lot of those votes, so they get looked after pretty well. But the small business sector is a smaller sector. Sure, there's 2.5 million of us out there, but really we aren't electorally very strong. And as a result, it's very easy to imagine for retailers and others, they've got a till, let's take some of their money. And it's always, we've got a till, we can pay. And we end up paying more than anybody else in the country. We also have challenges joining the energy transition, because many of us are renters of the businesses, so you don't get the opportunity to put on solar panels, etc. And it also depends on where you are in the country. So you live in Tasmania, where whilst we have plenty of sunlight, we don't have, we've also got lots of long winters as well. So the payback period for doing that is quite a lot longer than anybody in central Queensland, for example. So there are challenges in encouraging. And also, whilst I'm intimately aware of Tasmania, I think ACT and South Australia are probably in the same boat. Tasmania has, to all intents and purposes, 100% renewable energy anyway. So we don't care. Why do we need to go and spend lots of money on our own bat to do some of this thing when we're using hydro and wind power exclusively? So from our conscience point of view, from an environmental point of view, we're already sort of boasting with pride and think that no one can do it better than us anyway. So again, I think ACT are probably near that somewhere. South Australia are getting there. So do we really want to be part of this transition or not? It's going to cost us a fortune.
Well, I'll leave the federalism issues aside for the time being. We've also got someone from Western Australia up on the platform as well.
Federal system.
Throw this all on. Let's move on, though, to a couple of other factors. And there's some points here that are raised that I'll come back to shortly. But first, how do we tailor the solutions to fit some of these problems for the SME sector? Phil?
Well, this is a really interesting topic, and we could have a 2-day conference just on this for SMEs and the energy transition and energy and power pricing and whatnot. I don't know if you know, but the head of ASIC late last year said that the greatest transformation to business in Australia got passed by the Parliament in September, and we probably don't realise what happened, and that was the implementation of measuring the Group 1, Group 2 and Group 3 emitters, carbon emitters and greenhouse gas emitters in our country. Now that's the big end of town, and they're now going to need to report their carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions to the regulator, to ASIC. The issue for us as SMEs is if you're a supplier to one of those Group 1 emitters, those Group 1 emitters are going to be asking you what your carbon emissions are next year. And then Group 2 emitters, their Scope 3 emissions the year after that, and the Group 3 emitters, their supply chain will be asked the year after that. So we're going to capture hundreds of thousands of SMEs who probably today don't realise that that legislation passed in September and was implemented on January 1 for the Group 1 emitters. So this is the businesses we deal with. The transition is on, it's on now. Not only measurement is one thing, and that's fantastic that, I mean, my organisation, we emit 40 tonnes of carbon every year. I don't know if your organisations know that. What's your number? You're going to need to, and you're going to need to do it in the next few years. Ours is 40 tonnes. It's great to have the number. The second issue is, how do I get that down? We've got to hit a reduction target by 2030. How do I reduce? Now, this is the issue in the energy transition. I think we don't have a good understanding, and consumer groups, you guys probably don't understand what the 2.5 million small businesses are going to be facing in the next few years. So
Phil, when they come to you, your clients come to you looking for information on energy issues, what are the primary things they're usually asking for a hand with?
Yeah, so because we come from Western Australia, so we have primes in the mining and resources sector who've already putting emissions reduction targets on SMEs already. And so the first question is, how do I decarbonise our operations? So and the big one's diesel. How do you get diesel out? How do you get your plant and equipment to plug into an electric socket rather than connected to a motor? And so then the next question then is how do we get more power? So how do we get power to our premises? And what we're facing in WA, and this is where the regulators, if there's regulators in the room, aren't keeping up with the transition that's occurring right now. It's 18 months for a business to find out if they can get more juice into their premises. That's not commercial. That is far too long. It needs to be weeks at most, not 18 months to 2 years. So, if you can imagine today, if I'm supplying to a Group 1 emitter, I've got to start to measure my emissions. I'm going to start making CapEx decisions about what plant and equipment I've got, and I need to find out, can I plug in the machine to get more power? I've got to wait 18 months. That's beyond my initial reporting period, and 2030 is 4 years away. That can't happen. That's not real. So we've got a few troubles.
Well, let's take a look and drill down to a particular energy issue, that of embedded networks, which I think is one that would be well familiar to most of the people in the room here, but has its own wicked problems and its own challenges for the SME sector as well. Andrew, some observations on embedded networks. I just wrote the note, what about embedded networks? And I think that leaves it open as a fairly big topic.
Yeah, look, thanks, Michael, and I thought you'd never ask. I primed him for that one. Look, embedded networks, just as my day job is around providing compliance and risk advice to landlords, largely, about the embedded networks that they own and that they operate. And, of course, my clients are the ethical ones, and everyone else's are terrible. But we get to see some really awful behaviour. And I guess, so just to be clear, for those that don't know what an embedded network is, I'm going to I've tried to do, it's really hard to put a number on it, so I make some numbers up, but these are roughly right based on my experience. So about 10% of households live in an embedded network in Australia. Well, certainly in the East Coast. I'm not sure about over in the West, but we're working on getting more over there. Yeah. Anyway, largely apartment buildings. Carol, you still living in that apartment? Yep. Loving it? Yeah. Shopping centres, a lot of like logistics parks. We're seeing it in retirement villages. We see it in a club that I just joined, which is the Over 55s Club, in land lease communities. And it's a common practice. And the upshot is, if you're in there, you will be buying from your landlord. You will be paying as much as they can get away with. You don't have choice. You have no particular agency. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, particularly in the residential networks, is a lot of the consumer protections, and I was talking to Kiara about this yesterday, like a lot of the consumer protections around life support, family violence and all the rest of it, very, very hard to see that implemented with any great quality in those contexts, because you've got a lot of small players, they're unlicensed, you do not have to have a licence to operate an embedded network. You need to register it, or the landlord does, and then you can engage a party. Sometimes it'll be a party that also is an energy retailer, such as an Origin or Energy Australia or Energy Locals are in this space, but the bulk of it is done by energy businesses. It's something energy or whatever. They're unlicensed. They have no licence at risk. You can't take their licence away. You can't hold them to account in that way. And so we see some very poor customer service outcomes, and we see some very poor pricing outcomes. In the small business space, I'm going to argue from what we've seen that percentage of small businesses that operate in these sort of environments is closer to 20%. So if you can imagine, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 small businesses are buying their power from their landlord. And they do not get a good deal. They are almost entirely priced at the default market offer, which I come from Adelaide, the DMO for a small business is 50 cents a kilowatt hour. It is $5,000 for 10,000 kilowatt hours. You just wouldn't accept it if you're a household. So one of the observations, and so embedded networks are a microcosm of a lack of competition, if you like, and we rely on competition in these markets for small business customers. The ACCC reports, if you go through the spreadsheets, because that's where I go, because I'm an engineer, I don't bother reading the words. You look at the margins that are out there in the small business for small business customers, and they are outrageous. Like, we're talking 10 to 20% margins on the full bill stack for a retailer that is responsible for, if you ask them, less than half of that bill. Like, these are big margins, and the only way you can sustain big margins in this sort of market is it's a lack of competition or a lack of engagement from those customers to go and chase a better deal on the assumption that there's a better deal out there. And we know that the reasons why that is because people are actually busy running their business. And so, Pip, I'm going to say it again, behavioural economics. We regulate this whole game on rational economics. And a rational decision would be, I'm paying too much for my power, I'm going to do something about it. Well, behavioural economics would tell you, actually, I'm going to focus on the stuff I can influence, which is running my business. I'm a small business owner. I luckily have a very competent business partner. But we're always thinking about cash flow. We think more about cash flow than profitability. We think about our employees more than we think about ourselves. We're not, and we're in the energy game, so Craig, yes, we do actually check our bill, which is, we should, because we're what we do. But we don't put a lot of effort into that. We don't expect our clients are going to be able to do that as well. So there's embedded networks, horrible things, even though I make part of my living from working in them. But if anyone wants to ask me about embedded networks, right, I've got heaps of stories.
One of the interesting things about embedded networks, of course, and just in a simple example, for the Energy and Water Ombudsman, folk in the room, of course, is the recent transition only in the last couple of years and still a work in progress in most jurisdictions to bring embedded networks into the protections, the suite of protections. It's estimated that out of the 2.5 or thereabouts million small businesses in the country at the moment, less than half of them receive any consumer protection whatsoever because of a variety of factors. For example, the exclusion of ombudsman, different definitions of what constitutes a small business in different jurisdictions, and on again. So that suite of protections there is another issue. Now, we have got a couple of questions coming in on Slido, but one of the ones that just in terms of behavioural economics and looking at issues about how do we regulate or how do we set some of the areas, one of the interesting policy approaches in places such as the European Union, not so much just in energy, but more broadly in applying the suite of regulatory frameworks to the SME sector has been, well, if most of our businesses are small, why do we principally write laws that assume that everyone is BHP? Whether it be industrial relations, whether it be tax compliance, or whether it be energy, we assume that most businesses are big, sophisticated, and complex creatures with the resources. And so the European Union has an approach called Think Small First, which says that you basically regulate on the presumption that the entity is small and has limited resources. If you think that there should be a greater onus on a larger, more sophisticated firm, then you add it in. So the default, not the default market offer, but the default regulatory response is you are a small business, you have limited resources, we expect this. If you are BHP, as I said, or Coles or Qantas or whomever, then we expect you to go over and above, and here's the extra range. It's inverted to what we do.
Well, this was applied to a number of other policy areas when there was talk about, make it better for small, better for all. That was a sort of an expression that was bandied around a little bit. And it certainly, it's the case with everything. It's all complex, and the small business owner doesn't have the time or sometimes even the language or the understanding of the policy area, let alone the ability to read through all the documentation to fully understand what they mean. And so I think you're right. But this also isn't just about what governments think, it's also about retailers as well. And if you think about other issues like payments and surcharges, you default to the least cost and then you upsell to that business owner, better cybersecurity, better this, better that. But it should be defaulting to the least cost because then you're putting them in the position as a client instead of the other way around.
Now, I've got a question here that I'm going to throw to the panel, and because we're conscious of where we're at, we've got just under 10 minutes, we'll make sure we get you out for your afternoon tea, as promised. Here's a question at the top of there. What would be the most impactful change, the most impactful reform that we could undertake to benefit small business?
I've been looking at this for the last 10 minutes.
And still thinking on that?
And I literally cannot think of a singular thing. But if you look at the video, what they all talked about was cash flow and cost. So whatever it is, the focus for small businesses right now is that cost impost of energy. Unfortunately, it's not transition. Unfortunately, it's the concern and the fear of whether or not they're going to have the energy that they need and have reliable energy and to keep their costs down.
Rob,
we were talking about it a little earlier on, and I don't pay the energy bill at home. My wife does, but and yes, we're on the best rate, so that's great. But maybe there should be a tick for small businesses that if the retailer can determine that you could be on a better rate, you should be able to have some default tick that says, if my provider determines I can be on a better rate, please put me on it without asking me. It should be a default offer that you could be automatically on the better rate. That would actually be, that would at least give small business owners the comfort they know that with that provider, that is the best rate.
Default to the best. I think both residents and the businesses will be looking for that one. Phil?
So it's the best time ever to put solar on the roof of your business. The delta between the cost of the panels and the battery versus not doing it has never been, the price is the highest it's ever been and the cost of the panels and the batteries are the lowest they've ever been. So in terms of investment, return on investment, now is the best time ever. So we talk to our businesses about looking at the ROI and how you want to deal with it on the balance sheet. But putting aside that, so it's the best time to do it financially, but it's the landlord. And you can talk about some embedded networks issues, but it's the landlord. The landlord doesn't want... I've literally had landlords say, I don't want holes in the roof because of the bolts for the panels, so no panels.
Andrew.
I reckon we've run a bit of an experiment over the last 20 odd years about choice, and the regulatory framework is predicated on the idea that choice is the outcome we're trying to achieve. And I reckon we've now got enough evidence. There's, in South Australia, it's full competition, FRC as they used to call it, I can't remember what it stands for, it doesn't matter. That was 2003, so we've got 20 odd years of evidence that would suggest that the provision of choice has not delivered a good outcome for customers. I say, time to walk away, re-regulate, particularly for this cohort, fix a price, don't make it a price that's got headroom for competition. There is no competition. Competition has not surfaced. If it was going to show up, it would have shown up over the last 20 years. And one of the main reasons I say this is because I think small businesses do it tough, but a large number of the organisations that fit the small business category are actually in community services. They are delivering stuff for the community, and we had a story last week about a landlord client of ours that wanted to charge a roof rental to put solar on the property that was tenanted by a food bank.
Right.
Like, this is bonkers. People are greedy. It's time to walk away. Like, the idea that choice is the answer, I think, it's bullshit. Behavioural economics wins. People are too busy to do it. Don't offer them choice, just offer them good value.
Well, there you go. And Andrew's on a roll here because you're the most popular question up there as well. But I'll just get the mood in the room there. Actually, Phil, I think you made a similar comment as well about whether estate ownership is not something to be thought about again in terms of the debate. But just throw that one into the room there, just lob that in quietly, won't we? Yeah. I'll disclaim it as the chair of ECA. And I will come back to you in a minute, Andrew, on that last question. Rob, you wanted to make a quick comment?
The state ownership's interesting because I think Tasmania and North Queensland have similarities in that Tasmania owns the major generator, Tasmania owns the major transmission network, Tasmania owns the major retailer. So from that point of view, if you have a benevolent government, there are plenty of opportunities for them to have a little navel gaze and work out what is best for their community. Is it about charging the highest price possible and then putting into consolidated revenue, or is it by reducing that price from those utilities and making it as affordable as possible, or do you make a bit more money and look after the concessions, etc., as required on an as-needs basis? And again, interesting, looking at my home energy bill, I noticed there's a $75 credit there. So somewhere along the line, the Tasmanian government had decided that every residence is going to get $75 off the bill because we've got a bit extra in the bank. And yeah, so I ended up with a credit on the account. So that's fancy.
A quick comment, and then we're going to go over to
I would
better
say that those rebates, that rebate concept just completely fell flat with the small business community. Honestly, what is $325 going to do for your typical butcher who pays $12,000 a quarter for his refrigeration and his electricity cost? What is $325 going to do, really?
Yeah. Now, Andrew, one of the questions there, in case you can't see it, because your comments about embedded networks I think, Andrew, we're getting a fair bit of generation down this end of the table in terms of, coffee time conversations afterwards. Andrew, if we can't bring competition into embedded networks, should we ban them, goes the question. And it's got quite a few votes there. So, what say you?
Yes. Is there anyone from the AEMC in the room still? Oh, yeah?
There we go. There we go, yes. Yeah.
So, 2018, AEMC came out and said that the regulatory frameworks for embedded networks are not fit for purpose. The AR commenced an inquiry into the frameworks around the exemptions, which is overlaps, 2023 sometime. Rumour has it, it's been delayed a couple of times. Rumour has it there'll be a report that'll come out maybe this year. I've given up waiting. It is going to committee. Thanks, Ross. Look, it seems to be a wicked problem. I don't understand why it's so hard. I'm trying to put it in the context of what we've been talking about earlier today around that customer duty of care. And I think if you follow that logic, you're going to go, there is no way that a landlord is going to be the best provider of electricity for a tenant. Maybe they are. But there needs to be some real rules and guidance around it, just like there needs to be rules and guidance around just what a landlord can do to their tenants. But my short answer is, yeah, look, we don't need it. Look, it's... I can't see a benefit. I try, and there's something in there about sharing solar and stuff like that, but really that I think falls into the little leaf in the circle that you stick on the front of the whole show.
Well, hopefully this session hasn't been a leaf in a circle. Andrew, thanks for the comments. I'm going to pull it to an end there. I'd like to thank the panellists. Join me in thanking them for their contribution and their time.